I never thought I would have to bury one of my children before me. But that is exactly what Kim Sheely was forced to do 3 years ago. Her 28-year-old daughter, Shatisha Sheely, was one of 3 women whose bodies were discovered wrapped in garbage bags in East Cleveland. With tears streaming down her face, it is clear this mother's heart is still shattered, and the pain remains unbearably real. What does evil smell like? Ask the neighbors of East Cleveland, the ones who spent weeks in July of 2013 trying to tell anyone who would listen that something was dead in their neighborhood. That smell led police straight to a garage. And inside that garage, they found a body. That body was just the beginning of one of Ohio's most disturbing and deeply unsettling serial murder cases. If you are drawn to true crime stories like this one, make sure you hit that subscribe button for True Crime Tragedies. We bring you the most gripping cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Now let us get into this story. There is a moment that unfolded inside that courtroom, one you need to understand right from the very start. A grieving father had to sit there and watch the man who killed his daughter. And this is what he said. "My name is Van Cherry Terry. I am standing before you today. I suppose we are expected to find it in our hearts to forgive this man, the one who invaded our family and took my child from this world." The courtroom erupted. People who witnessed it said it was something they would never forget for as long as they lived. One person described it this way: "It was absolutely heart-wrenching. It was deeply frustrating to just sit there, to see the expression on his face, and to know the depth of his rage." When someone asked about the incident afterward, a person close to the situation reflected, "Were you surprised that he had done that?" "I was very surprised when it happened. But I could understand exactly why he did it. It was not something he had planned to do. But when he heard that his daughter had been mutilated, that was the part that broke him completely." That father, Van Terry, carried that weight and that pain until the very day he died. Van passed away in February of that year. When asked how Van was holding up in the wake of losing his daughter, the answer was one that cut straight to the bone. "Mr. Terry, I am so deeply sorry for the loss of your daughter. I truly appreciate your time today." "Thank you, sir. I appreciate you as well." My goodness, watching that footage, I must have seen it at least 6 times already today. "Why did you do it?" "I honestly do not recall doing it. It was an instance of grief. I simply snapped while I was speaking." "So you were up there delivering your statement, giving what is known as a victim impact statement. How far away from him were you?" "I would say anywhere from 10 to maybe 15 feet. "Did you look him in the eye?" "That was exactly what I was trying to do because I needed to see the person who had hurt my daughter. But when I turned around to face him and he hit me with that grin, I completely lost my mind." "He grinned at you?" "Yes, he did." "And so the man who murdered your daughter had the audacity to grin at you and you snapped and you lunged. What were you hoping to do?" "Honestly, I wanted to break his jaw. Get that grin off his face. Look, we are being honest here." "Yes, we are being completely honest." A lot of people talk about forgiveness when they stand up there in cases like this. Where are you with that right now? How are you feeling about it? Well, forgiveness is not really for the other person. Forgiveness is for yourself. Because you are supposed to forgive, so that person does not occupy so much of your time, so much of your heart, so much of your mind. You forgive them, and then you try to move forward with your life. But right now, it is still too hard for me. It has been 3 years. It is still too hard. I know he was sentenced to death. How do you feel about that? Is that what you wanted? Well, in Ohio, it is going to take a long while for that sentence to be carried out. If he were dying today, yes, I would want that. But it is going to take a long time. He has the right to appeal it. He is going to work through all the paperwork and all the legal process, and it is going to take years. So we have to wait for all of that. 10 years? That is far too long. And we have to pay for all of it. That is simply not right. There was also talk of you potentially facing charges yourself for doing what I am sure a lot of fathers in your position would have wanted to do. Break his jaw. Do you know if that is still on the table? No. I was not told anything about charges. They took down my name and my identification, but they did not say anything about charging me. And if charges do come out of it, I will face them when I face them. I am not going to question it or stress myself over it. Can we end this conversation, not talking about the man sitting across from you, but talking about your daughter instead? Can you tell me about her? Sharella is my angel. Everyone called her Shirto. I called her Heaven. That is how I name my children according to who they are. And she was my heaven. So to me, he took my heaven from this world. She was a praise dancer. She was a deeply spiritual person. She was heavy into the church. She was my reader, my bookworm. She was 18 years old. Every day is still hard. 3 years later, what do you miss most about her? Her hugs. Most people who knew her called her Hugzilla, because every single time she saw you, she wanted to wrap her arms around you. She was always right there on my arm. That is what I miss about her. Van Terry, thank you for your time. No, forgive me for cutting you off. Please, go ahead. Well, at work, I would have to gently pull her off my shoulder just so I could get anything done. But whenever she came down to visit me at the shop, she was holding on to me the entire time. I miss that. That is so incredibly sweet. It really is so sweet. I think a lot of parents watching right now are thinking they would have done the exact same thing had they been standing in your shoes in that courtroom. Thank you. And again, I am so deeply sorry for your loss. Thank you. No problem at all. You have a blessed one. You too, sir. We will be right back. How was he holding up with regard to losing his daughter? He never healed. That was something he was simply never able to make sense of, the question of why it happened. It was something he could never get over. You know how people always say that time heals all wounds? When you lose a child, time does not heal that wound. Real talk. That right there tells you everything you need to know about what this case did to these families. Now, Michael Madison was not what you would call a typical serial killer, if there even is such a thing. Born on October 15, 1977, this man came into a world that was already violent, already broken. His childhood was so severely traumatic that years later, his own defense team would use it as their primary argument for why the courts should show him mercy. But here is the thing about mercy. It is something his three victims never received. Angela Deskins, Shatisha Sheely, and Sharella Terry would each discover just how merciless their killer truly was. But the story does not begin with Madison's first murder. No, it begins with a discovery that would unravel everything he had spent months carefully concealing. July 19, 2013. Neighbors had finally reached their limit. For weeks, they had been enduring a foul and unmistakable smell, the smell of something dead drifting from a rented garage in their neighborhood. The neighborhood was already in decline, buildings abandoned, streets grown quiet. But this smell was something entirely different. When police broke down that garage door, what they found inside would stay with them for the rest of their lives. A woman's body, concealed inside multiple garbage bags. Within hours, investigators traced that garage rental to a single name, Michael Madison. This 35-year-old registered sex offender was living just a few blocks away, in a second-floor apartment directly above a vacant storefront. While police were securing their search warrants and mobilizing their entire operation, Madison was already planning his next move. But here is what they did not know yet. The body they had just found, it was only the beginning. The crime scene was about to stretch across multiple locations, and at least 3 lives had already been taken. The manner in which that body had been disposed of, so careful, so methodical, told investigators something crucial. This was not Madison's first time. He had practiced. He had refined his method. The question was no longer whether there were more victims. The question was how many more they were going to find. As word spread through East Cleveland's tight-knit community, families who had been missing their daughters, their sisters, their mothers for months began flooding the police with calls. Hope tangled with dread in every single one of those phone calls. Missing person reports that had been sitting untouched in file folders were about to take on a devastating new meaning. The hunt for Michael Madison had begun, and what investigators were about to uncover would shake that entire community to its foundation. This is the story of how one man's consuming hatred turned him into a killer, and how the smell of death finally delivered justice to East Cleveland. To understand the monster Michael Madison became, you have to understand the hell he was raised inside. His childhood reads like a textbook case study on how to produce a serial killer. It is a clinical illustration of how systematic and relentless abuse can warp a young mind into something unrecognizable, something dangerous beyond comprehension. He was born to Diane Madison, a woman who had herself been abandoned by her own drug-addicted mother. Michael never knew his biological father. John Baldwin denied paternity and simply disappeared, leaving Diane alone to raise a son she was profoundly unprepared to care for. But Diane's understanding of what parenting meant had been shaped entirely by her own trauma, perpetuating a cycle of abuse that would echo across generations. The violence began early. When Michael was just 2 years old, his mother subjected him to severe and repeated physical abuse. When he cried out from the pain, she beat him with an extension cord. This was not discipline. This was abuse pure and unambiguous. And it was only the beginning. Diane kept a revolving door of boyfriends, and each one brought new forms of cruelty. These men, temporary fixtures cycling through Michael's life, seemed almost to be competing with one another in their capacity for violence. One of those boyfriends beat the toddler so severely that Michael suffered permanent hearing loss in one ear and had to be rushed to a hospital. When social workers arrived to examine him, they uncovered something far more disturbing: evidence of sexual abuse. The Department of Child and Family Services finally intervened, but their solution, listen carefully, was nearly as damaging as the original problem itself. They placed Michael with his grandmother, a woman carrying her own deeply troubled history, who continued the very cycle of neglect and abuse. It was a classic case of removing a child from one dangerous situation and placing him directly into another. When Michael was eventually returned to his mother's care, nothing had changed. The beatings continued, the neglect persisted, and the hatred inside him festered and grew. By the age of 16, Michael had cultivated what he would later describe as a complete and total hatred of women. He had redirected the blame for everything he had endured onto the entire female gender, constructing a twisted and poisonous worldview that would ultimately drive him to kill. His teenage years were defined by escalating and increasingly dangerous behavior. At 17, he was charged with inappropriately touching a classmate, an early and unmistakable warning of the sexual violence that would come to define his adult crimes. At 20, drug charges landed him in jail, where he began to understand the kind of power that could be exercised through intimidation and physical force. The pattern was already clear. Michael Madison was learning to inflict pain on others as a way of reclaiming control over his own suffering. What had begun as a survival mechanism in childhood was quietly evolving into something far more dangerous and deliberate. The boy who had been victimized was transforming step by step into the man who would victimize others. By 2001, Madison's hatred had hardened into direct action. He attacked an 18-year-old woman, attempting to assault her before police intervened. He received a 4-year prison sentence that included mandatory treatment for sex offenders, but rehabilitation was never Madison's goal. He was simply learning to be more careful, more methodical, and considerably more dangerous. Prison changed Michael Madison, but not in the way society had hoped. Instead of rehabilitation, he found refinement. He learned to mask his violent impulses behind a convincing performance of normalcy, one that would make him far more lethal when he finally walked back out those doors. By 2005, he had served his time for the attempted assault and returned to East Cleveland, carrying a new and practiced understanding of how to avoid detection. Madison's post-prison life was carefully constructed to give him maximum freedom while attracting the least possible oversight. He registered his mother's address on the sex offender registry instead of his own, giving himself mobility while appearing fully compliant with the system's requirements. He established himself as a small-time drug dealer, a role that gave him both steady income and access to vulnerable women who might not be immediately missed if they disappeared from the streets. The man who emerged from prison was calculating and manipulative in ways he had not been before. Madison had learned to present himself as charming and attentive, qualities that would prove devastatingly effective in luring women who had no reason yet to fear him. He did not hunt randomly. He selected women who were isolated, who were struggling, or who were desperate for stability. His victims were not chosen for their appearance or their circumstances. They were chosen for their vulnerability. In September of 2012, Madison convinced a woman named Brittany Darby to move in with him. But this was not a romantic arrangement. It was a cover operation, deliberate and cold-blooded from the very beginning. Almost immediately after Brittany moved in, Madison announced he wanted an open relationship and began seeing another woman named Shanta Mahan. Brittany was relocated to the guest room, unknowingly serving as Madison's alibi while he began his campaign of killing. The timing was not coincidental. September of 2012 marked the beginning of Madison's murder campaign, starting with 28-year-old Shatisha Shaley. Shatisha was a devoted mother to a 12-year-old daughter and maintained close ties with her family throughout her life. On the day she disappeared, she had called her mother to arrange borrowing some money, but she never showed up for their meeting. Shatisha's disappearance did not raise immediate alarm at first. Her lifestyle had been somewhat unstable, and family members initially assumed she had simply moved on without telling anyone. That reaction was precisely what Madison had counted on: victims whose absence would not immediately trigger an intensive investigation. Next came 38-year-old Angela Deskins in June of 2013. Angela was a student at Cuyahoga County Community College who listed herself as self-employed in customer service. Her family reported her missing, but in a community where people frequently relocated without notice, missing person reports often received only limited attention. Madison was exploiting the brutal reality that some victims are mourned far more publicly than others. The final known victim was 18-year-old Sharella Terry, who vanished on July 10, 2013. Sharella had been working a summer job at a Cleveland elementary school when she disappeared. Unlike the previous victims, Sharella's disappearance immediately triggered an intensive search. Her father, Larry Terry, flooded the streets with missing person posters and refused to accept that his daughter had simply vanished into nothing. Throughout this entire period, Brittany Darby continued living inside Madison's apartment, completely unaware that she was sleeping just a few rooms away from the evidence of his crimes. Madison's ability to compartmentalize his violence while sustaining ordinary relationships demonstrated a level of psychological control that made him exceptionally dangerous. The predator had perfected his craft, but he was about to make the single mistake that would destroy everything he had built. What makes Michael Madison's crimes particularly chilling is not only the murders themselves, it is the calculated, deliberate manner in which he continued living his daily life while hiding what he had done. Before we continue, if you have not already done so, go ahead and subscribe to True Crime Tragedies. We cover cases in depth, bringing you the stories you will not find covered anywhere else. Alright, let us keep going. For months, he maintained his relationships and presented himself as a functioning member of the community. This was not someone who had acted in a moment of passion. This was the methodical routine of a predator who had learned to normalize horror as a way of life. Brittany Darby's testimony would later pull back the curtain on the deeply disturbing reality of living alongside Madison during his killing spree. In early July of 2013, she began noticing an increasingly powerful smell of decay filling every corner of their shared apartment. The odor was so overwhelming that it was affecting her ability to sleep and to function with any semblance of normality. When she finally confronted Madison about the smell, his response was both creative and deeply revealing. 2 raccoons died in the hall closet, Madison explained with disturbing casualness. When Brittany moved toward the closet to investigate, Madison stepped quickly into her path. "You do not want to see that," he warned her. "It is gruesome." The fact that Madison could deliver that lie while knowing exactly what was inside that closet that tells you everything about the depth of his psychological detachment from reality. But Madison's performance was becoming harder and harder to sustain. The smell was growing stronger and neighbors were beginning to take notice. He was forced to move evidence from the apartment closet to a more remote location. Years later, during his police interrogation, Madison would describe in detail the process of moving what he had hidden, details that would haunt everyone in that room. The logistics of Madison's crimes reveal the work of someone operating with careful planning and a complete absence of empathy. He was not acting in moments of uncontrolled rage. He was methodically selecting, harming, and concealing evidence, all while maintaining the appearance of an entirely ordinary life. Madison's choice of disposal sites was not random. He selected locations within a tightly confined area near his apartment places where he could monitor the possibility of discovery while maintaining easy and frequent access. The garage where the first body was found had been rented specifically for this purpose, giving Madison a controlled and private environment for his crimes. Meanwhile, the families of his victims were living inside their own private hell. Shatisha Shaley's mother, Kameda, was enduring the compounded trauma of her daughter's disappearance alongside the death of her son in an entirely unrelated home invasion. When Shatisha failed to appear at her own brother's funeral, the family's worst fears began to solidify into something they could no longer push aside. "She is never coming back, but we just cannot bring ourselves to accept it." The murder of a child is something Kim Shiley has now had to accept not once but twice. Her son was murdered just 7 months before her daughter. "And now I am going right back through the same thing. I am tearing open wounds I tried to seal inside myself. Wounds I never forgot, wounds I will always carry." Angela Deskins's family was frantically searching for any trace of their missing daughter. Sharella Terry's father was plastering missing person posters across every surface in Cleveland, refusing to accept that his daughter had simply vanished. As the summer of 2013 wore on, Madison's carefully managed control was beginning to fracture. The smell had become impossible to ignore. Neighbors were asking questions, and the summer heat was accelerating the process of decomposition. The predator, who had successfully concealed his crimes for months, was about to be undone by the very evidence he had spent so much effort trying to hide. July 19, 2013, began like any other day in East Cleveland, but it would end with a discovery that brought Michael Madison's reign of terror to a sudden and decisive end. The stench that had been building for weeks had finally become completely unbearable. forcing neighbors to take action that would unravel one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in the history of Ohio. When police broke into that rented garage and found the first body, they immediately understood they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple homicide. The methodical way the evidence had been concealed told them this was the work of someone who had experience, someone who had done this before and fully expected to do it again. Someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. The name Michael Madison appeared on the garage rental agreement, immediately focusing the entire investigation on the registered sex offender living just blocks away. But Madison was not at his apartment when police arrived. He had fled to his mother's house, perhaps sensing that the carefully constructed world he had built around himself was finally about to collapse. What followed was a 2-hour standoff that ended with Madison's arrest and the beginning of one of the most extensive crime scene investigations in the history of Cleveland. The search that followed the arrest revealed the true and full scope of Madison's crimes. Within 24 hours, investigators had discovered 2 additional bodies in locations near the original garage. One victim was found in a nearby field. Another was discovered in the basement of an abandoned house. All 3 bodies showed the same methodical pattern, concealed in ways specifically designed to delay discovery. The community response was immediate and overwhelming when police announced they were conducting a comprehensive search of the entire area. Over 100 volunteers showed up to assist investigators searching vacant and abandoned buildings throughout the neighborhood. The mobilization revealed both the community's fierce determination to find justice and their collective and very real fear about what else might still be hidden among them. During his interrogation, Madison made a statement that sent a chill through the entire investigation team. He referenced Anthony Sowell, the Cleveland Strangler, who had murdered 11 women in the same area just years before. Investigators began to wonder whether Madison had been inspired by Sowell's crimes, perhaps seeing them as a blueprint for his own killing spree. The parallels between Madison and Sowell were profoundly disturbing. Both were registered sex offenders who had targeted vulnerable women in the same East Cleveland neighborhood. Both had methodically concealed evidence in ways designed specifically to delay its discovery. Both had continued their ordinary lives while hiding their crimes from everyone around them. The question that haunted investigators was whether Madison was a copycat killer or whether there was something about East Cleveland itself that drew this particular breed of predator. Madison's eventual confession provided some answers, but it raised a new set of questions that no one could fully resolve. He admitted to killing Shatisha Shaley, but claimed he had no memory of killing the other 2 victims. This selective amnesia was not unusual among serial killers, who frequently compartmentalize their crimes as a mechanism for maintaining psychological stability. The investigation revealed that Madison had spent months hiding evidence, relocating it when necessary, and sustaining relationships on the surface while concealing his true nature from everyone who knew him. His ability to function with apparent normalcy while committing these crimes demonstrated a level of psychological control that made his eventual capture all the more significant. The trial of Michael Madison began on April 4, 2016, bringing together the families of his victims, the community he had terrorized, and the justice system that would ultimately decide his fate. What emerged over the course of the proceedings was a portrait of a man who had methodically planned and executed his murders while showing absolutely no remorse for the lives he had destroyed. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Madison had confessed to killing Shatisha Shaley. Physical evidence connected him directly to all 3 crime scenes, and witness testimony laid out in clinical detail his pattern of deliberately targeting women who would not be immediately missed. The defense team attempted to use Madison's traumatic childhood as the foundation for an insanity plea, arguing that the systematic abuse he had endured had created a mental illness severe enough to render him incapable of controlling his actions. They presented evidence of the horrific violence Madison had suffered as a child, the abuse, the neglect, and the complete absence of stable relationships that had defined every year of his early life. But the prosecution countered with something the defense could not explain away. This was not someone who had snapped in a single uncontrolled moment of rage. This was a predator who had carefully selected his victims, methodically concealed his evidence, and maintained elaborate deceptions over a prolonged period of time to avoid detection. The planning and forethought embedded in every step of his crimes directly contradicted any credible claim of mental incapacity. The jury deliberated for a remarkably short period of time before returning a verdict, finding Madison guilty on all 14 counts, including 3 counts of aggravated murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of gross abuse of a corpse, 1 count of rape, and 1 count of weapons possession by a convicted felon. The verdict was unanimous. It was decisive. and it left no room for doubt. During the sentencing phase, the families of Madison's victims finally had the opportunity to stand before the man who had destroyed their lives and speak. The most powerful moment came when Sherella Terry's father, Larry, took the stand to deliver his victim impact statement. As he spoke about the pain of losing his daughter, Madison began to smile, a display of callousness so profound it would have tragic and irreversible consequences in that courtroom. Larry Terry's reaction was immediate and entirely understandable. Watching his daughter's killer smirk while he described his own grief, Terry lunged across the courtroom directly toward Madison. Court officers intervened immediately, pulling Terry away before he could reach the man who had taken everything from him. The incident captured in a single devastating moment the raw and uncontainable emotion and the overwhelming sense of injustice that had driven this case from its very beginning. On May 20, 2016, the jury formally recommended the death penalty for Michael Madison. The judge accepted their recommendation, sentencing Madison to death for the murders of Angela Deskins, Shatisha Shaley, and Sherella Terry. The sentence was later unanimously upheld by the Ohio Supreme Court, which found that the aggravating circumstances of Madison's crimes clearly and decisively outweighed any mitigating factors presented by the defense. Madison's appeals have been consistently denied, and as of 2024, he remains on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. The case that began with the smell of death drifting through an East Cleveland neighborhood had finally reached its legal conclusion. But the emotional impact on the families and on the community continues, and it will continue for as long as those who loved those three women are still alive. The conviction and sentencing of Michael Madison marked the end of his legal proceedings, but it did not mark the end of his story's impact on those he left behind. The families of his victims, the community of East Cleveland, and the broader justice system all continued to grapple with the consequences of his crimes long after the courtroom doors closed for the final time. For the families of Angela Deskins, Shatisha Shaley, and Sherella Terry, Madison's death sentence provided a form of justice, but it could never restore what had been taken from them. Each family faced the unique and unending challenge of grieving for a loved one whose life had been cut short by senseless and deliberate violence. The public nature of the crimes meant their grief was conducted under constant media scrutiny, adding another suffocating layer of difficulty to a situation that was already beyond what any person should have to endure. Shatisha Shaley's mother, Kameda, faced the particularly devastating combination of losing both her daughter and her son within months of each other. Having to identify her daughter's remains after months of forcing herself to hope that her child was still alive, somewhere that was a trauma that would mark her for the rest of her life. The strength she displayed throughout the investigation and throughout the trial became something others drew from when facing their own losses. Sherella Terry's father, Larry, became an advocate for missing persons cases, using the brutal education of his own experience to help other families navigate the devastating process of searching for someone they loved and feared they had lost. The fact that two serial killers had operated within the same area within such a compressed period of time raised urgent and uncomfortable questions about what factors made this particular community so vulnerable to this specific type of predator. Investigators noted that both Madison and Sowell had deliberately targeted women who were struggling with addiction, with poverty, or with other serious life challenges. Women whose disappearances were statistically less likely to trigger the kind of immediate and intensive investigation their families deserved. In a tragic epilogue to the Madison story, his mother Diane was killed in 2019 during a home invasion. The bitter irony that the woman who had helped produce a killer through years of abuse ultimately became a victim of violence herself was not lost on anyone who had followed this case closely. The cycle of violence that had defined Michael Madison's childhood had not ended with his arrest. It had continued, claiming another life in another generation. The Michael Madison case stands as a stark and enduring reminder of how childhood trauma can shape a person into something monstrous, but also of how the justice system must hold individuals fully accountable for the choices they make as adults, regardless of the circumstances that preceded them. While Madison's horrific upbringing provides a framework for understanding how he became what he became, it does not and cannot excuse the deliberate choice he made to take the lives of three innocent women. While Madison's horrific upbringing helps explain his development, it does not excuse the choices he made as an adult to take three lives. Today, Michael Madison remains on death row, his appeals exhausted, his fate sealed by the courts that reviewed every argument his defense could make. The families of his victims continue to rebuild their lives while carrying the permanent and invisible weight of scars his crimes left behind. The case stands as a testament to both the devastating reach of serial murder and the profound resilience of those who survive in its aftermath, not unscathed, but still standing. If this story moved you or made you think, do me a favor and subscribe to True Crime Tragedies. We are dedicated to telling these important stories with the respect and the depth they deserve. Hit that subscribe button and join our community. Thank you for watching. 3 women were found wrapped in garbage bags in East Cleveland, and the man responsible had been hiding in plain sight all along. For months, neighbors reported an unbearable smell drifting from a rented garage, but no one acted fast enough to save the victims. Shatisha Shaley, Angela Deskins, and Sharella Terry each vanished without triggering the urgent response their families desperately needed. Their killer was a registered sex offender living blocks away, hiding evidence in plain sight while maintaining the appearance of an ordinary life. Michael Madison did not snap in a moment of rage. He selected, planned, and concealed his crimes with calculated and deliberate precision. His childhood was marked by severe physical and sexual abuse, a broken system that failed him at every turn and produced a cycle of violence. That history explains how he became dangerous. It does not excuse the 3 innocent lives he chose to destroy as an adult. Predators like Madison deliberately target women whose disappearances they calculate will receive the least urgent response from authorities. Every missing person deserves the same urgency. Every family deserves the same determination to bring their loved one home. When communities speak up early, lives are saved. The smell of death in East Cleveland was a warning no one acted on fast enough. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong in your neighborhood, report it to local authorities immediately and document what you observe. If someone you know suddenly changes their behavior, withdraws from routine, or makes disturbing comments, take that seriously and speak up. Advocate for equal urgency in missing persons investigations. Every victim deserves relentless, immediate attention, regardless of their background. Support organizations fighting for marginalized victims and for communities that have historically been underserved by the justice system. Sharella Terry's father refused to accept silence. His persistence gave his daughter a voice when the system almost let her disappear. That kind of determination from families and communities is often what forces justice to move when institutions fail to act on their own. Van Terry called his daughter Heaven and said she was the one who always wrapped her arms around him wherever he went. Angela, Shatisha, and Sharella were daughters, mothers, and students. Their stories deserve to be told with the depth they were always owed.